Have you ever seen some new supplement online and thought, hey, maybe my doctor could prescribe this for me? I mean, it makes sense, right? They're the doctor. But whoa, not so fast. There is a massive, and I mean massive, rule book that governs all of this. Today, we're going to crack open that rule book, figure out what it actually takes to get a prescription, and see why these rules are, well, absolutely critical for keeping us all safe.
All right, so let's just cut right to the chase. Here's the big question. Can a doctor, with all their years of training and experience, if they genuinely believe some new, maybe unproven drug could work for a patient, can they just write a prescription for it? What do you think? Yes or no?
And the answer is a big, fat no. It's a huge, common misconception. A doctor can't just go rogue, no matter how good their intentions might be. There's a really strict federal rule book they have to follow, and trust me, it's there for a very good reason. So let's dive into the first chapter. Okay, so the absolute foundation of this entire system, you could call it the golden rule, is FDA approval. Seriously, everything else we're going to talk about today hinges on this one single incredibly important concept. All right, so here's a term you've got to know. It's unapproved new drug. And this isn't just, a friendly suggestion. It is baked right into federal law. Basically, if a substance hasn't gotten the green light from the FDA for any therapeutic use at all, it is flat out illegal to prescribe. This is exactly why you see those sketchy websites selling research chemicals. It's often their way of trying to sneak around this law. And let me tell you, that is a massive red flag for safety. And getting that FDA stamp of approval? Man, it's not easy. It's like winning an Olympic gold medal in science. We're talking years, sometimes even decades, of grueling work. You've got lab research, animal studies, then massive clinical trials with thousands of people. All of that creates a literal mountain of data that FDA experts have to comb through. So when you see that FDA-approved label, you know that drug has been put through the absolute ringer to prove it's safe and that it actually works. Okay, so the rule seems pretty black and white, right? No FDA approval, no prescription. Simple. But what if I told you that about 1 in every 5 prescriptions written today is for a use that the FDA never actually approved? Kinda wild, huh? Welcome to the fascinating and yes, totally legal world of off-label prescribing. So here's the key distinction you have to get. The FDA regulates the drug companies and how they can market their drugs. They do not regulate the day-to-day practice of medicine. And what that means is, once a drug gets approved for one thing, a doctor can then use their professional medical judgment to prescribe it for something else. A classic example is a beta blocker. It's FDA approved for high blood pressure, but doctors very commonly prescribe it off-label to help with things like stage fright or performance anxiety. And this right here is probably the most important thing to understand about this whole topic. Off-label use is not a free-for-all. It's not a loophole. It is a very specific tool that lets doctors use drugs that have already been proven safe for at least one condition. It is absolutely not a backdoor to start prescribing unapproved substances or those research chemicals we talked about. That line in the sand is crystal clear, and it's there to protect patients. You know what they say, right? With great power comes great responsibility. And when a doctor decides to prescribe a drug off-label, they are taking on a lot more professional responsibility. That's why they have to document their reasoning so carefully, and they absolutely have to have a clear conversation with you, the patient, about the potential risks and benefits. It's a high-stakes decision, and it's one that requires a ton of careful thought. Okay, so everything we've talked about so far has been about those mass-produced drugs that come from big pharma companies. But what happens if a patient needs something different? Like, what if you're allergic to a filler or a dye in a pill? Or maybe your kid can't swallow pills and needs that medicine in a liquid form. Well, that's where the world of compounding pharmacies comes into play. And you guessed it, they have their own unique chapter in the rulebook.
And here's a really, really big point to remember. Compounded drugs are not FDA approved. I mean, think about it for a second. How could they be? You can't run a huge clinical trial on a medication that's being custom-made for just one single person. It's just not possible. And because of that, there's a whole different framework of rules designed to keep these personalized medications safe.
One of the most important rules for compounding is what's known as the essentially a copy rule. In plain English, a compounding pharmacy can't just mix up their own version of a commercially available drug you could buy at Walgreens. That's not what they're for. The whole point of compounding is to create a solution when the mass-produced, FDA-approved drug doesn't work for a specific patient, not to just make a cheaper knockoff. But that leads to a pretty obvious question, right?
What happens when a patient needs that FDA-approved drug, but you can't get it? Like it's just not available anywhere? Well, that's where the drug shortage exception comes in. If the FDA puts a medication on its official drug shortage list, then that, essentially a copy rule we just talked about, gets temporarily waived. That allows compounding pharmacies to step in and make that drug to fill the gap in the supply chain. But, and this is a big but, it's not up to a local pharmacy or clinic to just declare a shortage. They have to check the official FDA list. It has to be a formally recognized shortage.
Okay, so let's say your doctor decides you need a compounded medication. Where does it come from? Well, it turns out not all compounding pharmacies are the same. In fact, there are two very different kinds, and knowing which is actually pretty crucial, especially for patient safety. Okay, let's break this down, because the difference here is really important. On one hand, you have what are called 503A pharmacies. The easiest way to think of these is as your traditional local compounding pharmacy. They're regulated by state boards of pharmacy, and they make a specific drug for a specific patient with a prescription. They follow quality standards called USP. Now, on the other hand, you have 503B facilities. These guys are a whole different ballgame. They're big, they're registered directly with the FDA, and they can manufacture large batches of drugs without individual prescriptions, which they then sell to hospitals and clinics. And because of that, they have to follow much stricter federal standards called CGMP. That stands for Current Good Manufacturing Practices. These are the same incredibly high standards that big drug manufacturers like Pfizer have to meet. This is why things like in V therapies, where you need absolute sterility, often come from these 503B facilities. Phew, okay, that was a lot of rules and regulations, I know. So let's try to tie it all together. What does this complicated rulebook actually mean for you as a patient? Let's think of it as a playbook for making sure you're getting the safest care possible. So, a good provider is constantly thinking about these things, vetting their pharmacy partners, verifying a drug status, documenting their choices, and getting your consent. But here's the thing. These are also questions you can ask. Don't ever feel shy about asking your doctor, hey, is this drug FDA approved for what you're prescribing it for? Or is this a compounded drug? If so, where does it come from? Honestly, being an informed and engaged patient is one of the most powerful tools you have to stay safe. And all of this really boils down to one of the biggest questions in modern medicine. We're in this amazing era of personalized medicine with so much innovation happening. So how do we balance all of that exciting progress with the absolute need for these rock-solid safety rules we've been talking about? There really isn't an easy answer, but it's a critical conversation for all of us to be having. What do you think is the right balance?